Before we get into this week's discussion of Wordsworth and Coleridge, I want to spend the beginning of this lecture talking a bit about this term romanticism and this word romantic. It is a notoriously poorly defined term, so I want to make clear one thing: we're not going to spend this semester trying to define it. Instead, I want us to think about what has historically been called romantic and how that term has been used and how its usage has changed over time. So, for starters, let's think a little bit about how we use this word romantic today. We typically use the term to describe a kind of love. It's not familial love or the love of a friend, but it's a sexual love, and that's a very modern idea of the word. So, if we rewind about 200 years, the word romantic is used to describe a person who's hot headed or passionate, a person who casts aside reason in favor of emotion. But the term extends way beyond people and love. A romantic landscape is a landscape that's wild and not cultivated. Romantic ideals are liberal, not conservative. Romantic, in other words, is a term not applied to love or to a period of literature, but to a mindset, a way of thinking. So, where does this mindset come from? Well, it's a reaction in many ways to the Enlightenment. Many of you have read literatures from the Enlightenment period, or at least familiar with this intellectual movement. If you aren't familiar with the Enlightenment, that's fine. We're going to do a brief slideshow of two gardens that I'm going to compare for you that will illustrate, hopefully by example, the difference between Enlightenment thinking and Romantic era thinking. Okay? The first slides we'll look at are of Hampton Court Palace's gardens. These are formal 17th and 18th century gardens. You'll want to note the order and the organization. Nature yields to man's power. The aesthetic is one of formality and of symmetry. Here is a picture of Hampton Court Palace, the country retreat for kings, renovated and landscaped most famously by that corpulent, wife-killing king we know as Henry VIII. Now, the dates of the age of the Enlightenment are debatable, but they do not stretch back to Henry VIII. Most people think of the Enlightenment as the dominant intellectual revolution of the 18th century. But some people stretch it back to the 17th century, and it's easy to see its roots so early. Here's a picture of Henry's gardens. Well, not the gardens he planted, but the 17th century version of them that survives. They are highly refined and landscaped, with all of those little hedges and bushes yielding under the strong hand of the landscaper, and by extension, the strong hand of the monarch. Notice the exactness of the garden's design. This is a French style of gardening, but also a monarchic style of gardening. It suggests power, dominance, and the supremacy of man over nature. The gardens at Hampton Court are precisely organized, very symmetrical, and this echoes the primary impulse behind the Enlightenment. It's a time in which reason and logic are highly prized. Now, as you can imagine, the constraints of the age of reason were felt quite strongly by writers and artists. So what we've come to think of as a romantic aesthetic begins, at least initially, as a reaction to and rejection of the principles of the Enlightenment. Wordsworth, whose poems we'll read this week, calls good poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. As you can see, this definition of what is good, or what is romantic, poetry is already a reaction to the feeling of being contained and restricted. Just like with a cup of water, you must first contain the water before you can overflow it. That process of containment and overflowing symbolizes the friction between the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. So let's look at an example of landscape gardening from the Romantic period. These next images are of Roche Abbey and its surrounding grounds, which were designed by a man named Lancelot Brown. You may have heard of him referred to as Capability Brown, which was his nickname. Roche Abbey is the ruin of an 11th century abbey. In 1774, Lord Scarborough hired Capability Brown to landscape his property. And so, completely disregarding history, Brown rips down all the other buildings on the abbey's grounds, leaving a park of man-made rolling hills. His goal was to make the abbey appear desolate, a ruin of the past overtaken by nature's power. Of course, if you look at this landscape, there's nothing natural about it. The whole thing is contoured by man. Nature does not mow lawns or make perfectly undulating hills that lead right up to the Abbey's front door. The idea behind Capability Brown's romantic revolution is to show how nature has triumphed over man. It's a landscape that reminds you that people were here, but now they're gone. Nature is supposed to be seen as all-powerful, even though, in reality, everything, like this little waterfall, is man-made. We often use the start of the French Revolution as a convenient starting point for the Romantic era. But that start date of 1789 is kind of arbitrary if you think about it. As you can see, Capability Brown's work in the 1770s is just as good a representation of a romantic aesthetic. And if you continued backwards to read the literature and view the art from the middle of the 18th century, you see hints of the romantic aesthetic going way back. Now, before we turn to Wordsworth and Coleridge, I have one last point that I want to make about the French Revolution. This was a war in which the proletariat classes overthrew the monarchy and tore down the aristocracy. Scary. They championed the rights of the common man. And so, if as a starting point for Romanticism, 1789 seems kind of arbitrary, why not let the start of the war serve as a kind of model for what romantic means? If you overthrow a dictatorial government and then champion the rights of the common man, that's a pretty good model for the intellectual revolution that was taking place when Romanticism started to challenge Enlightenment thinking. Now, let's move on to the poets for this week. Many of the poems you'll read this semester are drawn from Wordsworth and Coleridge's 1798 collection of poems. They titled it Lyrical Ballads. This was a collection of poems supposedly written in what Wordsworth called the real language of men. Now, what does that mean, the real language of men? Well, anyone who's read a few poems from Lyrical Ballads, as you'll do this week, will quickly realize that these poems are not written in real language. They use complex language, and they often address quite heady intellectual subjects. Here's another little secret. Wordsworth and Coleridge, they are not the common man. They are Cambridge-educated poets from the landed class. So, what's real about the real language of men? Lyrical Ballads was not written by the common man, and it was written not for the common man, but at least the poems are written about commoners. The people in these poems are lower class, they are tenant farmers, they are country bumpkins. Now, the choice of this subject matter might seem relatively insignificant, but keep in mind that until this point, poetry had been predominantly written by and for and about the wealthy aristocratic classes. Wordsworth and Coleridge's romantic revolution in Lyrical Ballads was to suggest that perhaps poetry should be about real people too. Now, how did the elite readers of poetry receive this book? Can you guess? Well, poorly, of course. When it was first published in 1798, this book was completely slammed by reviewers. And if you want to go read the reviews, they're really, really funny. In 1800, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they tried again. And they put out a second expanded edition. It was better received than the first edition, still not exactly a smash hit. Over time, the common man's experience, that way of life that Wordsworth and Coleridge sought to validate, that has come to be established as an essential part of Romantic era works, but it wasn't always. So, before I close out this lecture, I want to leave you with one little piece of guidance as you prepare to do your readings. As you dive into the poems for this week, I'd like you to keep an eye on not just what you're reading, but how you're reading. Try to work out the difference between what a poem is connoting and what it is denoting. Keep in mind that what a poem says and what a poem implies, those are two very different things. And if you're ever lost and you have no idea what the hell you're going to write about for your assignment, just try to focus on the difference between what the poet states and what the poet suggests. That will usually help you frame an argument. That's it for this week. See you in class. Bye.